I'm now down at Stevens Park down in Kershaw, South Carolina. This is just up Highway 601 north of Kershaw. And this is a pretty nice little park. It's got everything from a pretty substantial playground area to a bowling alley to a lot of trails, and also even a skate park and such. There's an amphitheater. It's just a pretty good facility. The thing that I'm going to talk about today, we've got a trail system here, and part of the trail system is such that we're going to go and walk some of the trails. As we walk some of the trails, I want to talk about one thing, and I want to focus on the thing I want to focus on today is the thing called succession. And succession is where you have a certain amount of material vegetation or even not vegetation there, and then it can go through changes over time to where it can actually become a forest. And 40-acre rock is a good example, and that's what we saw last time, where we have just solid rock, and it's called primary succession when you go from rock and eventually evolve into forest. But what I'm going to talk about today is really going to be what we call secondary succession. And secondary succession is where you go from this area was old farmland and cotton fields and stuff like that. So we want to talk about its history in relation to what it was, and then look at it today and see what it is today, and look at the type of vegetation and stuff that we have that will help us learn its history by looking at what's here today. So that's what we're going to do today here at Stevens Park in Kershaw, South Carolina. When we think about succession, we think about areas like 40-acre rock, where there's just rock, maybe some lichen growing, and there's really no other vegetative material or living material there. That's primary succession, where you go from nothing until you get to a mature forest. Secondary succession or old field succession would be where you go from existing plant material or existing conditions, and then it evolves into its mature or climax forest. Usually what will happen is after it's finished farming and it's no longer farmed, then it'll go to grasses, broom straw, perennial grasses, and then maybe some hardwood sort of things like hypericum, St. John's wort, and such like that. And then it'll start evolving into some smaller tree species. Cedars, I can think, would be an early colonizer, and then pine trees. And then eventually you'd get sweet gums, maples, and tulip poplars. And then beyond there, you may have oaks and hickories. Our mature forest in our area is really an oak hickory forest. So it goes through that successionary stage and can go to where it goes from a little bit of plant material from a farmed body of land, and then evolving into that mature forest. And that's secondary succession, which is what we're looking at here, primarily at Stevens Park. One thing the park has is a lot of items that'll help you understand what's out here. One is it has little signs with QR codes that'll tell you about the area you're walking through. The other thing it has some signboards in different places that'll tell you about what you're going through. The QR codes are also located along some of the plants that you'll see along the trail, and if you want to scan it, it'll pull it up and tell you what it's about this. So they've done a real good job of allowing people to use the park and understand what they're walking through, which is pretty good. Now we're beginning to walk into an area, and this is one of the woodlands that's just bordering the parking lot. And what we've got here is an interesting mix. We've got young pine trees that are not too old. What happens with pines? Pines are one of the first colonizing trees, and the reason is that they need open areas for their seeds to germinate and actually grow. If they don't have open sunlight, then what'll happen is they just really won't mature. So this tells me that when we look at this area was open fairly recently. These pines, I'm not exactly sure the age of them. We've got some fairly old ones here, but we also have some young ones that have come up. Now among those we see some oak trees, and these are probably water oaks. I think so, yes. This is a water oak. You can tell by its leaves. It's narrow at the base and then flares out at the tip. So what we've got is water oaks are coming up, and the water oaks can actually come up among the shaded area. that the pines can't. So what is happening is these pines are here, they're in the canopy layer now, so they're able to survive. But once they die, the oaks will populate this area and the pines will not be able to come back. There are some things that can affect that. One thing is fire. As fire comes through, it can burn out the oaks on the lower levels and then allow the pines to generate and such. So it's a transition sort of time. These pines will grow to their full size, then eventually die out. The oaks are going to come back beneath them. I do see some sweet gums. There's a sweet gum over here. There are also vines that are growing in here. And one interesting thing about the vines are there's certain vines that can climb trees and certain vines that climb with trees. Grapevines, Vitis rotundifolia, is one that climbs with the tree. So as it gets in the canopy, it'll actually grow with that canopy. It can't fix itself to the side of a tree. Poison ivy, on the other hand, can fix itself to the side of a tree and actually grow up the tree. So when you see grapevines, you wonder how it got up in that tree so high, and it actually grew with the tree, which is kind of a neat deal. So we're going to walk on through this trail and see what we have down here. One thing that is pretty interesting right here is we're at this area, and you can see how here's a sweet gum that's growing up underneath. Here's some maples that are growing up underneath. Here's another oak, and this is actually a turkey oak, or it looks like maybe a hybridized oak between a water oak and a turkey oak. But we see some of the pines. Here's a fairly sizable pine, but behind it we have a magnolia. And magnolias are real interesting. This is Magnolia grandiflora and folia. And what happens is that it's going to have the ability to grow up in here, and does fairly well because of the big leaves and such. But it's interesting because magnolias have a symbiotic relationship with woodpecker in our area, and the woodpecker is the pileated woodpecker, in that the pileated will select these trees and eat the seeds out of those. The seed pod is such that we used to throw them and think they were hand grenades when we were little kids, but it's about so big, and it has the seeds of the magnolia inside of it, and the pileated woodpeckers just love them. So if you see magnolias, especially in the forest like this, listen and you may hear a pileated woodpecker. It's got that sort of, if you feel like you're in the deep, dark jungle sort of sound. It's an exotic sort of sound, but one of the most beautiful woodpeckers around. It's the one that Woody Woodpecker is patterned after. So you see these magnolias, listen for the woodpeckers. If I hear one, I'll see if I can get it on film. Now this is what's interesting about these sorts of places. If you can't realize it by looking at the camera, but I've only walked, just probably 25 yards or so from where I was before. And the forest changes instantly. In that case, we had a lot more pines. It was obvious that was open at a certain time. Here we still have some pines, but they're of a certain size. So if you could get the age of those trees by doing a core, then you could find out really kind of what happened at that particular time. But we have a lot of small oaks here, but very, very few pines. It could be that there was a fire that came through at the time or whatever. Now some of the pines are fire adapted. Longleaf pine is one that's fire adapted, and it'll essentially be in the grass stage down on the lower of the ground. It can be burned over but still survive because it's deep enough if it's not a hot fire. And then what'll happen is it'll store energy, and then all of a sudden it'll grow up 3 or so feet in 1 year to try to go beyond that fire vulnerability. So longleaf pine's fire adapted, but maybe there was something that happened here that opened this up. And the thing is, it just makes you ask questions, which is kind of the neat part of it. What was this like? What happened to it that made it the way that it is? Which is really a pretty neat sort of deal. Now while I'm walking through, I just couldn't help but stop at this particular plant. This one is one that's fairly common. This is sassafras, and if you'll notice, it's got 3 different leaf types. Here's one type, and this is a trident-shaped leaf. It has another type that's called entire, and this is an entire leaf right here. It has no lobes or whatever on it. And then it has another shape that's typically a mitten-shaped leaf, and I'm trying to find one on this plant, and here's one right here. So what it has is it has 3 leaf types, a trident-shaped, a mitten-shaped, and an entire, all on the same plant. But sassafras is an interesting sort of plant. It's one that I don't know, I get kind of excited about it. One of my students one year dug the roots and made sassafras tea for us. The interesting thing about this is it reproduces by seed, but also can reproduce by roots under the ground, so it's an interesting sort of deal. This is a real interesting area down towards the water, and the creek's going down through here, but it ends up making a pretty good bog here. The creek starts really with a spring right probably about 50 to 75 yards up the hill, and it comes from what we've got sandy soil here, and then we've got an impervious layer underneath it, and the water percolates through the sandy soil, hits that impervious layer, and then pops out at the spring back there. But what we've got just a really lush sort of area. We've got 3 different types of ferns that are right here staring at us, which is really kind of neat. This is royal fern. Royal fern's not exactly the most common one you'll see, but this is Osmunda regalis is its name. But royal fern, we have bracken fern all right here, and then we have cinnamon fern out here too, right here. But we just have a real lush habitat. Here's our red maple that we saw before. There's a tulip poplar over here, and the other trees dominate pretty well. We have our vine smilax. This is a different smilax from the rotundifolia that we saw before on one of our other films, but we have smilax kind of everywhere the vine is growing on this material. So a real lush area, but it's lush because of the presence of water here, which controls really the habitat all around us. This is switch cane. Switch cane is Arundinaria gigantea, and it grows. We have cane breaks in South Carolina that are fairly common sort of areas. But a real neat spot. You can walk through this little boardwalk out to the stream itself and take a look inside and just see what it's like there. So a neat little spot here. A lot going on that you'd never really realize how much is going on. And this is what's interesting. Whenever you do a little natural history lesson, you get a kind of possessed by the area that you're in, because I walked 10 feet and here again I can look and I can see willow trees here. There's a whole story there. Aspirin is derived from an extract of willow bark. Willow bark teas would have been the thing to cure fevers and such in the past, and now we use aspirin to do the same thing. Willows here along this edge of the wetland sort of area. We also have what we call sedges here, and sedges look like grasses, but if you'll feel the edges of them, when we reach down and feel those, what happens is the stem of these are triangular, and whenever you see that triangular edge, it tells you it's likely going to be a sedge, and we'd say sedges have edges, and that they have that triangular sort of edge. I encourage you to, I know we don't have too much time, but I encourage you to come down here. This is really a neat spot, and you can see I can walk 10 feet and see something totally different. It's just amazing sort of place. Spend some time, read the little signboards as you go through, but enjoy some of this. Is one of the little hidden gems at one of the parks around us. So enjoy this. This is Stevens Park down in Kershaw, north off of 601. So hope you have a great day. I know that I am. Thank you. Bye-bye.